Most people think the amount they're approved for is the amount they can afford. And that misunderstanding is how buyers get stuck stressed, house poor, and regretting their decision. Today, we're breaking down how much house you can actually afford in 2026. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Sam Enright, and sitting across from me is my co-host, Zach Dixon. And today, we have a very important podcast episode. We are talking about how much house you can afford in 2026. Obviously, with the change of the new year, we felt this was a very prevalent podcast to record, as most people are going to, well, hopefully be embarking on the home buying journey here this year. And we really wanted to break down, what that looks like and what to expect this year in the housing market.
Absolutely, guys. Welcome to 2026 here. This episode is definitely an important one. Like Sam mentioned, we're going to be walking through some of the biggest mistakes that buyers are making when setting their budget. And obviously, like Sam mentioned, this is one at the beginning of the year where hopefully some of you guys are starting to think about that home buying journey itself and want to get started on that journey itself. And so wanted to walk through some of the mistakes and how some of these how people get started on the home buying journey here in 2026. So if you're planning on buying in the next year or two, this is one that matters for you for sure.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. It's always important, I think, to revisit this every year, right? I know we recorded an episode in 2025 kind of along these similar lines and how much house can you afford in 2025. Obviously, we all know, prices are continuing to kind of stay where they're at. We're not really seeing anything go down. Rates have been very steady as well. The cost of living is up for debate. We are being told that it's cheaper than it was by all of our government entities, but I don't know about anybody else, but my pockets are not necessarily feeling this cheaper. These cheaper bills and everything that goes along with that, right? So obviously this is it's a fluid thing. It's something to revisit. It's something to always look at because markets change. Things are dictated by, what housing prices are doing, what interest rates are doing, what our budget and bills are doing. And so it's really important, obviously, to look into these things, especially if you're considering buying, here in the next year or so. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about today, which is going to be approved versus comfortable. So this is something that we see a lot of on our side of, working with clients, right? On the lending side, when we're issuing pre-approvals, when we're talking to people about how much house they can afford, we are always having the conversation about, well, let's look at, what is on paper versus necessarily what you're comfortable with. And that's why the first question I always ask clients when we speak with them is, do you have an idea of where you're looking to be at budget-wise? Have you guys sat down? Have you looked at, hey, here's the bills that are coming out. Here's where we can, maybe expect, the utilities and the things such as, gas, water, trash, internet, all those things that go into a house, right? Making a house a home, having all of these things that you need outside of just your mortgage payment, your property taxes, all of that. And so, when we're looking at a pre-approved client, you guys got to understand on our side of things, we are looking at gross monthly income. So that is pre-taxed income. So if you make $40 an hour and you're working 40 hours a week, we would take that income, times that out, 40 by 40, times that by 52 weeks a year, divide that by 12, and that would be the monthly income that we are using. Now, obviously, goes without saying, you are not getting all of that money. You're paying, federal taxes, state taxes, income taxes, any sort of, 401k withdrawals, any sort of medical insurance deductions, all kinds of different things that can potentially be coming out of your paycheck, right? So those things have to be taken into consideration on your end. And then also when we're looking at debt, we're only looking at what is reporting on your credit. So if you have things like auto loans, or you have personal loans, you have credit cards, you have any medical bills, those sort of things that would be reporting on your credit report are going to be the things that we are going to look at. And that is what we are going to determine what your debt to income ratio is. And then also, we're only looking at a small portion of what you're paying out monthly. We're not taking into account phone bills, car insurance, any sort of subscription based services, you know what I mean? Things like Netflix or gym memberships, or just really a whole different spectrum of things. And so I think it's ultimately important that the very first thing that you do when we do start talking about pre-approvals, if you haven't already, is sit down and really evaluate where your budget is at. Really evaluate what money you have going out versus what money you have coming in, and what would be a comfortable payment for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is, you hit the nail on the head. Unfortunately, in this process, you as the lender are not going to be seeing the majority of the obligations, bills that the buyer has to their name. Obviously, you're going to be able to see all of the debts that they have to their name, but they have, more than likely, they're going to have other bills, other obligations each month that are not going to be showing up, and that the only person that knows about them is going to be the buyer. That's the only person that's going to be able to, put this budget together accurately. Unfortunately, the budget that you as the lender are putting together is accurate, but it's not necessarily including all of the things that we have to take into account when we go to buy that home, and to make sure that we're not house poor. Because again, utilities can be variable. All of the things that might make up the financial picture of your household are not going to be revealed in this scenario. And so ultimately it does fall back on you. You can't go back to the lender and be mad at them that they didn't, put together this full encompassing budget for you when you got approved for the home, because ultimately that is not their job. They are just paying attention to the debts, the obligations that you have. And so again, it really just falls back on you, and you just have to be making sure that you are prepared when you get started with this journey as the home buyer.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because, we have had clients in the past who, have come back a year, 2 years later, and, are looking to do a refinance or looking to do something to kind of help. Maybe they had a major thing, pop up in their life. And, obviously there are a lot of things out of our control, right? You can't control major life changes, or any sort of accidents that come along that maybe put you out of work, or any of those things unfortunately are out of our control. But what we can control is obviously what we do when it comes to putting ourselves in the best position possible that we can. I'm only ever really going to suggest to people to stretch budgets when it's one of those things where, like, maybe the husband has the better credit score and the wife needs a little bit of help and she can't be on the loan, but we know that she has an additional income, right? And so, the husband, I would say, if we're only using his income, okay, hey, well, let's stretch the budget. We know that your wife is working and making an income, and we're not taking that into account on our end, but we know that it's there. And so, us stretching this is not necessarily the end of the world, because maybe you have another gross $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 coming in every single month, from your wife working, that's going to help account for those bills. That would be a situation where I would not necessarily be stressed about stretching, debts income ratios or stretching a budget. But, when you look at clients, again, that, maybe have a higher debt load, and they have, those things on credit, we're going to have those conversations. Hey, we're pretty close here on debts income ratio. Where do you want to be budget wise? Are we sure that you are comfortable with this? Because again, it sounds great in theory, right? When you go through, you get excited, you see the house and you become emotionally attached, and you see all these things that go along with it. And you're like, I can do this. I can make it, I can make it work. But, if something major comes through and maybe sweeps you off your feet, that could be a potential issue. So, we got to kind of think about it. Obviously we want you to be emotionally invested in the home. We want you to love it. We want you to, enjoy it, be like, this is awesome. But, we also need to be smart about it and not, make sure that we're not overextending you and putting you in a bad position. And I think that's really important, because, I guess maybe not everybody thinks about that.
For sure. And I think it's because ultimately they, We've stressed this enough in our podcast and content in general for surrounding yourself with the right team and trusting the people around you. I think that, sometimes buyers have this assumption that it's all going to be done by you, by the lender, which unfortunately some of the bill of duty falls on you as the buyer, and you have to, take account for that and be responsible for sure. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, hearing this, if you're going to plan to buy this year is vitally important, because you can already start working on some of this stuff yourself, and maybe even trimming some of the fat, right? Like if you look through your budget and there's, things that you're spending money on that you don't necessarily need to be spending money on, those are things that you could start, working on, maybe cutting out so that you could afford, more of a house payment and those sort of things.
So moving on to our next aspect of the episode, it's really going to be talking about what your payment really includes. And this is just talking about your mortgage payment. And we touched on it a little bit in the first segment, but this mortgage payment does make up a few different aspects past just the actual mortgage itself. That is, and obviously the mortgage itself is paying towards the home, paying the principal down on the home, and you're also at the same time paying interest on the loan as well. The interest is how the bank is making money on lending the money to you for your loan. Ultimately, at the beginning of the loan, most times the majority of your payment, the vast majority, is going to be interest only. You're going to have a little bit going towards principal each month, but it's actually kind of astounding when you get on there and look at the mortgage statement and how little your principal is reduced here in the first 12, 24, 36 months of your loan. It's kind of taken me aback a little bit as a first time homeowner here in 2025. But past those two things, obviously you're going to have your property taxes, which are varied depending on the area that you live in. Certain school districts could be one number, and then you go over a couple blocks over into a different school district, and it is a completely different number as well. So that is something you definitely have to take into consideration when you're starting your home buying journey and your home buying search, and trying to obviously lock down a location that you're looking for, but that will all lead you to the amount that you're looking for in taxes, and that number can definitely change your monthly payment as a whole as well. So definitely something you want to be aware of when you get that journey started. Next is going to be your property insurance. Obviously, this is self-explanatory. You got to have insurance on your home just in case something does happen to it, catastrophic. I guess you don't necessarily have to have insurance, but if you're getting financing, getting a loan, more than likely 99% of the time that lender is going to require some sort of insurance over that, because obviously they don't want to be on the hook for rebuilding the entire property itself as well. And so a couple of other things like we mentioned as well is utilities and maintenance. Obviously that is not going to be made up into your monthly mortgage payment itself, but utilities are going to be paid separately to the utility companies usually, and then maintenance is going to pop up as it happens as well. And you never really know, as we've talked about in the content in 2025, that you never really know when that could happen. So always want to be prepared for maintenance issues to arise on your home. That is unfortunately part of being a homeowner, but ultimately does lead to greener grasses on the other side as well, when you're able to get into the door as a homeowner and be able to fix those things how you want them, and enjoy those fixes later on as well. So the last one that will make up your kind of monthly mortgage budget is going to be if you're in a HOA or a COA, homeowners association or condo association. Basically, in these associations, you will be provided services, usually things like landscaping, snow removal, depending on the makeup of the property. Sometimes some maintenance items are included as well. And so being able to take a look at that, see what is included in that, see what things you don't have to pay outside of the HOA. Sometimes it'll include things like utilities, water, trash removal. So that will take away from the budget outside of, your monthly on the utilities side, but it will increase the HOA fee that you're paying as well. So kind of just have to weigh those options out, see what it takes, see what it looks like within your budget, and kind of make that decision from there. If the HOA fee is $150, but it includes water, trash, and snow removal landscape, that is not a bad little deal, because ultimately, your water bill is probably somewhere around $75 a month. Trash is probably $50 a month. And so to be able to get snow removal and landscape services for 12 months out of the year for $25 a month, usually that's a pretty good little deal. So ultimately, you just want to be kind of aware of these things before you, are making offers, number one, but ultimately before you get the journey started, because it'll allow you to make a little bit better decisions based on the numbers that you can afford and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Those are very, very key points when talking about what your payment actually includes. And so, one of the things that was not mentioned in there also was mortgage insurance, going to be a part of your monthly mortgage payment as well, unless obviously you are going with a conventional loan program and if you're a buyer, putting at least 20% down, upfront. All loans, all government loans other than VA are going to have a monthly mortgage insurance payment. So FHA, USDA going to be there for the life of the loan. Conventional, once you do reach 80% LTV, that mortgage insurance will fall off. So, something to take into account that can vary, with FHA and USDA, they're set percentages based on your loan amount. So, USDA is the lowest, it's 0.35%, and then FHA is 0.55%. And, conventional works a lot like, thinking about rates, right? So you do a certain quote. So just it takes into account debt to income factors, or DTI, it takes into account, credit score, and then loan amount, those sort of things, when looking at, what that's going to be. So something to consider, obviously, when looking at your payment as a whole. We talked about, obviously with the mortgage, you're going to be able to take care of your taxes, your insurance, your mortgage payment, your mortgage insurance, all of that's going to be included most typically in your full mortgage payment. Sometimes you can waive escrows, but there's very specific guidelines that have to be met in order for you to be able to do that. HOA, obviously, one of those ones, just depending on the area that you live in. We don't deal a whole bunch in these ourselves specifically, but I know, looking at, we have some loan officers down in Florida, and I know that those are very, very popular down in Florida, is HOAs and different just associations that take care of those, sort of things. So, and then the utilities and maintenance, I think, is really the one that, you got to definitely pay attention to, because again, it's not included in your mortgage payment, but they are there, and you got to be prepared for those. So your mortgage payment isn't your full payment. And that's where most buyers get surprised.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. Honestly, throughout your time as a loan officer, how many times have you dealt with a buyer like that has maybe been surprised with, all of the things that make up a mortgage payment, or, maybe the utility aspect of it? How many times have you had that happen in your career?
I mean, on the utility side, not a whole bunch, just obviously because normally, I feel like I have seen the sheets, right, where the agents will get, kind of an idea of what the seller's currently paying, who their current utilities are with, that sort of thing. And so, I have seen those tucked inside of purchase contracts, just as like I guess a courtesy to the buyer of,
Yeah.
like, hey, this is what this looks like. And, and I feel like we work with a lot of great agents that do a good job of, kind of taking that burden off, just because obviously you guys are the ones out looking at the home, talking with the listing agent, talking with the seller, and having that direct communication of, like, okay, well, this is where we're at. These are the ones that, this is what this currently looks like, right? And so, normally, that is something that is at least discussed on the front end, so they, have a general idea. But it is very common for us to, when we quote payments, right, for clients to be like, oh, that's just for my principal and interest. And I'm like, no, that's everything included. When we quote payments, we're going to give you the whole thing. And, a lot of times, clients will come in and they'll think that they're just, we're just quoting just principal and interest. We're not including taxes, not including insurance, but obviously in the last 4 years, I guess almost coming up on 4 years now, we're almost, February of 2022 was really when rates started to kind of go back up, from the post, pandemic, post COVID time period. So obviously over that time period, clients have been, when you're touching almost 8% interest rates, you're touching 7% interest rates. Yeah, there's a lot of surprise when it comes to quoting mortgage payments. Like, oh my gosh, that house is that much of a payment. I'm only borrowing this amount of money, and so it is one of those things where, you know, it's fluid again, like just based on the market, just based on what's going on. But yes, I mean, over the last couple of years, it's definitely been a lot more of like surprise, a little bit of confusion, a little bit of just taken aback of like the whole, situation scenario. Because I don't know if you guys ever want, I guess maybe something sickening to look at, go look at your mortgage payment, now versus what it would have been in 2021 if you'd gotten a 3% interest rate. Because, it may not seem like it, but 3.5% difference in an interest rate makes a completely world of a difference when it comes to your monthly mortgage payment. So, that's been something that's been much more prevalent, I would say, over the last couple of years.
For sure. And I think just on the utility side as well, for the most part, people, when they go to buy their home, they've been at least a renter for, 1, 2, 3 years. And so they have probably had experience on setting up new utility accounts and paying the utility accounts separately. I think that there may be some disconnect for renters when those utilities are included within your rent price. So if you're a renter that has, electric included, gas included, water included, you don't have to pay any of those, separately. They're all included in your rent payment. I think that is where I've seen the most surprise out of people. Not very often, but it is, they just not something they think about when they've been renting for the last 2 or 3 years, and then they go to buy a home, and now it's something new that gets thrown on them. And so I would say that that's probably the biggest example I've seen. So why don't you get us started with our third and final segment here of the episode?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the last things we wanted to talk about, which I kind of touched on just a bit, in the beginning about, affordability versus comfortability, is lifestyle, a lifestyle reality check for you guys. So, these are things that, again, sometimes can go very overlooked. When I look at the home buying process as a whole, I look at it in I recognize that it can be a very emotional time, right? There's a lot going on. There's a mix of excitement. There's a mix of, I guess maybe nervousness or anxiousness when it comes to these sort of things. And it's very easy to get caught up in that 30-day process, or even that, 45, 60-day process, depending on how long you've been out looking for a home, but it's very important, again, to take into account, what do you want your lifestyle to look like? When you do own a home, what do you still want to be able to accomplish? Do you still want to, like I said, be able to go on that vacation once a year or twice a year? Do you still want to be able to go, out to dinner here and there? Do you still want to be able to take the kids or go out with friends and go just do different things? Those are all things that have to be taken into consideration, because, again, these are all part of your monthly budget numbers when it comes to looking at everything as a whole. So, it's really, really important to not only just look at that lifestyle, but also look at savings, look at emergencies. Obviously, if any of you guys have, listened, again, we're not financial advisors or anything, but, I've done a little bit of digging in on the research on that side of things. And, I've worked with some different financial planners, and, the consensus is normally, hey, have 3 to 6 months in an emergency fund, just in case, 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. And so, being able to save for those, being able to have additional money to set aside for those things, because, again, life has a lot of unexpected twists and turns. I'm only 29 years old, but I can tell you firsthand that there's been a lot of twists and turns that have come in my life that, when things seem to be going great, sometimes things will come along, and, when things are going bad, sometimes things will come along and you'll have a great break. So it's not, one more than the other, but, that's just part of life, right? We have these moments where, things are going to happen, and you want to be prepared for that, right? So really, really sit back when you go and start this process and start to think about your budget numbers, what you want. If do you have an emergency fund? Have you saved for that? Is that something that you feel you need? Maybe just a generalized savings account as well. Different things. Do you want to be able to invest? Do you want to be able to go on the vacations? Do you want to be able to go out to the dinners? Do you want to be able to go hang with friends and do different things? Those are all very, very important things to consider when it comes to your lifestyle and owning a home. And it's not a situation where you want to get into and, not be able to do those things, right? Because if all you can do is own your home, as much as you love that thing, I'm pretty sure there's going to be some resentment down the road at some point.
I couldn't agree more at all, because it's 100% true. It's 100% real. And honestly, it just goes back to kind of the conversation that we were having in the first segment there is this isn't really public knowledge. This isn't stuff that your lender is going to know about. Your lender isn't going to know about how often you like to go out to dinner with your significant other or with friends. Your lender's not going to know how often you like to take trips or like to go on vacations. So ultimately, this is stuff that you have to do as the buyer. You have to be able to look out for yourself and make sure that you're not putting yourself into a bad situation based off of obviously the needs and necessities of the home, making sure you can make your mortgage payment, taxes, insurance, HOA fees, all of those things, but also the things that you want as well, the things that you want to do with your life. Again, it's going to breed resentment if you are not able to do the things you want because of the situation that you put yourself into. It's going to breed resentment with yourself, your partner, your lender, your real estate agent, all of the above. And so ultimately, I think it's just super important for the buyer to understand his or her role at the beginning in this process and how it works and how it kind of all ebbs and flows successfully and not unsuccessfully. So these things are important as human beings. We enjoy to go out to dinner with our friends. We enjoy going on vacation. And so to be able to not put those things to the wayside and continue to achieve our goals is ultimately what we're looking to do as human beings. We don't want to put one to the side for the other and disregard the other and not pay attention to those things. And so if you're buying a home in 2026, this is the very first episode you should listen to. We're breaking down affordability step by step so that you do not regret your decision later on.
Love it, man. I think that's kind of all we had. Obviously, just a little bit of a refresher from the 2025 episode that we did. Obviously, as the year progresses and when things do update and change from a market standpoint, because ultimately we're really pretty much in the same spot that we already were, earlier this year, earlier in 2025, when we had originally spoken kind of about this topic. We will keep you guys up to date, make sure that we're keeping the content coming. But guys, if this episode helped you, please feel free to send it and share it with someone that's looking to buy in 2026. Obviously, we would love to help anybody that we can with this information. And that's all I got for today's episode. Zach, you got anything to add before we wrap up here?
Not really. Just want to reiterate that it hasn't changed over the last 12 months, but market conditions definitely do change and can definitely affect, the payment as a whole, the purchase price as a whole. All of those things can definitely be affected by changes in the market. And so ultimately it hasn't changed right now, but it doesn't mean that it won't change over the next 6 to 12 months. So definitely want to make sure you're prepared and just well educated before you get this journey started.
Absolutely. Perfect closing note to leave it on.
Well, absolutely, guys. Appreciate you guys tuning in, and hopefully you guys have a great rest of your day.